the new god of power, the new gods of power, the new god of power, the new goddess of power, the new goddesses of power, the new goddess of power, the old god of power, the old gods of power, the old god of power, the old goddess of power, the old goddesses of power, the old goddess of power, the greater god of power, the greater gods of power, the greater god of power, the greater goddess of power, the greater goddesses of power, the greater goddess of power, the lesser god of power, the lesser gods of power, the lesser god of power, the lesser goddess of power, the lesser goddesses of power, the lesser goddess of power, the higher god of power, the higher gods of power, the higher god of power, the higher goddess of power, the higher goddesses of power, the higher goddess of power, the lower god of power, the lower gods of power, the lower god of power, the lower goddess of power, the lower goddesses of power, the lower goddess of power, the greater spirit of power, the greater spirits of power, the greater spirit of power, the lesser spirit of power, the lesser spirits of power, the lesser spirit of power, the higher spirit of power, the higher spirits of power, the higher spirit of power, the lower spirit of power, the lower spirits of power, the lower spirit of power, the major god of power, the major gods of power, the major god of power, the major goddess of power, the major goddesses of power, the major goddess of power, the minor god of power, the minor gods of power, the minor god of power, the minor goddess of power, the minor goddesses of power, the minor goddess of power, the superior god of power, the superior gods of power, the superior god of power, the superior goddess of power, the superior goddesses of power, the superior goddess of power, the inferior god of power, the inferior gods of power, the inferior god of power, the inferior goddess of power, the inferior goddesses of power, the inferior goddess of power, the ancestor god of power, the ancestor gods of power, the ancestor god of power, the ancestor goddess of power, the ancestor goddesses of power, the ancestor goddess of power, the ascendant god of power, the ascendant gods of power, the ascendant god of power, the ascendant goddess of power, the ascendant goddesses of power, the ascendant goddess of power, the descendant god of power, the descendant gods of power, the descendant god of power, the descendant goddess of power, the descendant goddesses of power, the descendant goddess of power, the transcendent god of power, the transcendent gods of power, the transcendent god of power, the transcendent goddess of power, the transcendent goddesses of power, the transcendent goddess of power, the past god of power, the past gods of power, the past god of power, the past goddess of power, the past goddesses of power, the past goddess of power, the present god of power, the present gods of power, the present god of power, the present goddess of power, the present goddesses of power, the present goddess of power, the future god of power, the future gods of power, the future god of power, the future goddess of power, the future goddesses of power, the future goddess of power, the authentic god of power, the authentic gods of power, the authentic god of power, the authentic goddess of power, the authentic goddesses of power, the authentic goddess of power, the synthetic god of power, the synthetic gods of power, the synthetic god of power, the synthetic goddess of power, the synthetic goddesses of power, the synthetic goddess of power, the progressive god of power, the progressive gods of power, the progressive god of power, the progressive goddess of power, the progressive goddesses of power, the progressive goddess of power, the regressive god of power, the regressive gods of power, the regressive god of power, the regressive goddess of power, the regressive goddesses of power, the regressive goddess of power, the ordinary god of power, the ordinary gods of power, the ordinary god of power, the ordinary goddess of power, the ordinary goddesses of power, the ordinary goddess of power, the extraordinary god of power, the extraordinary gods of power, the extraordinary god of power, the extraordinary goddess of power, the extraordinary goddesses of power, the extraordinary goddess of power, the static god of power, the static gods of power, the static god of power, the static goddess of power, the static goddesses of power, the static goddess of power, the dynamic god of power, the dynamic gods of power, the dynamic god of power, the dynamic goddess of power, the dynamic goddesses of power, the dynamic goddess of power, the land god of power, the land gods of power, the land god of power, the land goddess of power, the land goddesses of power, the land goddess of power, the sea god of power, the sea gods of power, the sea god of power, the sea goddess of power, the sea goddesses of power, the sea goddess of power, the sky god of power, the sky gods of power, the sky god of power, the sky goddess of power, the sky goddesses of power, the sky goddess of power, the god of power, the gods of power, the god of power, the goddess of power, the goddesses of power, the goddess of power, the half god of power, the half gods of power, the half god of power, the half goddess of power, the half goddesses of power, the half goddess of power, the vessel of power, the vessels of power, the vessel of power, the name of power, the names of power, the name of power, the person of power, the persons of power, the person of power, the persona of power, the personas of power, the persona of power, the personage of power, the personages of power, the personage of power, the personality of power, the personalities of power, the personality of power, the personification of power, the personifications of power, the personification of power, the image of power, the images of power, the image of power, the imagination of power, the imaginations of power, the imagination of power, the belief of power, the beliefs of power, the belief of power, the thought of power, the thoughts of power, the thought of power, the word of power, the words of power, the word of power, the action of power, the actions of power, the action of power, the reaction of power, the reactions of power, the reaction of power, the feeling of power, the feelings of power, the feeling of power, the situation of power, the situations of power, the situation of power, the circumstance of power, the circumstances of power, the circumstance of power, the environment of power, the environments of power, the environment of power, the relationship of power, the relationships of power, the relationship of power, the number of power, the numbers of power, the number of power, the formula of power, the formulas of power, the formula of power, the equation of power, the equations of power, the equation of power, the theory of power, the theories of power, the theory of power, the symbol of power, the symbols of power, the symbol of power, the color of power, the colors of power, the color of power, the thing of power, the things of power, the thing of power, the way of power, the ways of power, the way of power, the place of power, the places of power, the place of power, the time of power, the times of power, the time of power, the event of power, the events of power, the event of power, the result of power, the results of power, the result of power, the crown of power, the crowns of power, the crown of power, the throne of power, the thrones of power, the throne of power, the power king, the power kings, the power kingdom, the power kingdoms, the power king's subject, the power king's subjects, the power king's dominion, the power king's dominions, the kingdom of power, the kingdoms of power, the kingdom of power, the power queen, the power queens, the power queendom, the power queendoms, the power queen's subject, the power queen's subjects, the power queen's dominion, the power queen's dominions, the queendom of power, the queendoms of power, the queendom of power, the power prince, the power princes, the power princedom, the power princedoms, the power prince's subject, the power prince's subjects, the power prince's dominion, the power prince's dominions, the princedom of power, the princedoms of power, the princedom of power, the power princess, the power princesses, the power princessdom, the power princessdoms, the power princess is subject, the power princess is subjects, the power princess is dominion, the power princess is dominions, the princessdom of power, the princessdoms of power, the princessdom of power, the lord of power, the lords of power, the lord of power, the lordess of power, the lordesses of power, the lordess of power, the priest of power, the priests of power, the priest of power, the priestess of power, the priestesses of power, the priestess of power, the ritual of power, the rituals of power, the ritual of power, the shrine of power, the shrines of power, the shrine of power, the temple of power, the temples of power, the temple of power, the leader of power, the leaders of power, the leader of power, the follower of power, the followers of power, the follower of power, the natural substance of power, the natural substances of power, the natural substance of power, the supernatural substance of power, the supernatural substances of power, the supernatural substance of power, the temporal substance of power, the temporal substances of power, the temporal substance of power, the spiritual substance of power, the spiritual substances of power, the spiritual substance of power, the natural form of power, the natural forms of power, the natural form of power, the supernatural form of power, the supernatural forms of power, the supernatural form of power, the temporal form of power, the temporal forms of power, the temporal form of power, the spiritual form of power, the spiritual forms of power, the spiritual form of power, the age of power, the ages of power, the age of power, the era of power, the heiress of power, the era of power, the awakener of power, the awakeners of power, the awakener of power, the awakening of power, the awakenings of power, the awakening of power, the realm of power, the realms of power, the realm of power, the dimension of power, the dimensions of power, the dimension of power, the zone of power, the zones of power, the zone of power, the frequency of power, the frequencies of power, the frequency of power, the century of power, the centuries of power, the century of power, the millennium of power, the millenniums of power, the millennium of power, the purpose of power, the purposes of power, the purpose of power, the meaning of power, the meanings of power, the meaning of power, the culture of power, the cultures of power, the culture of power, the demonstrator of power, the demonstrators of power, the demonstrator of power, the demonstration of power, the demonstrations of power, the demonstration of power, the manifester of power, the manifestors of power, the manifester of power, the manifestation of power, the manifestations of power, the manifestation of power, the presence of power, the presences of power, the presence of power, the glow of power, the glows of power, the glow of power, the goal of power, the goals of power, the goal of power, the plan of power, the plans of power, the plan of power, the book of power, the books of power, the book of power, the philosopher of power, the philosophers of power, the philosopher of power, the philosophy of power, the philosophies of power, the philosophy of power, the releaser of power, the releasers of power, the releaser of power, the release of power, the releases of power, the release of power, the variable of power, the variables of power, the variable of power, the cause of power, the causes of power, the cause of power, the effect of power, the effects of power, the effect of power, the journey of power, the journeys of power, the journey of power, the emergence of power, the emergences of power, the emergence of power, the source of power, the sources of power, the source of power, the originator of power, the originators of power, the originator of power, the origin of power, the origins of power, the origin of power, the forefather of power, the forefathers of power, the forefather of power, the foremother of power, the foremothers of power, the foremother of power, the ancestor of power, the ancestors of power, the ancestor of power, the descendant of power, the descendants of power, the descendant of power, the lineage of power, the lineages of power, the lineage of power, the heritage of power, the heritages of power, the heritage of power, the heir of power, the heirs of power, the heir of power, the co-heir of power, the co-heirs of power, the co-heir of power, the joint heir of power, the joint heirs of power, the joint heir of power, the dynasty of power, the dynasties of power, the dynasty of power, the force of power, the forces of power, the force of power, the law of power, the laws of power, the law of power, the pact of power, the pacts of power, the pact of power, the game of power, the games of power, the game of power, the mask of power, the masks of power, the mask of power, the armor of power, the armors of power, the armor of power, the sword of power, the swords of power, the sword of power, the shield of power, the shields of power, the shield of power, the force shield of power, the force shields of power, the force shield of power, the armored force shield of power, the armored force shields of power, the armored force shield of power, the champion of power, the champions of power, the champion of power, the guardian of power, the guardians of power, the guardian of power, the defender of power, the defenders of power, the defender of power, the protector of power, the protectors of power, the protector of power, the chant of power, the chants of power, the chant of power, the shape of power, the shapes of power, the shape of power, the cube of power, the cubes of power, the cube of power, the cuboid of power, the cuboids of power, the cuboid of power, the sphere of power, the spheres of power, the sphere of power, the spheroid of power, the spheroids of power, the spheroid of power, the prism of power, the prisms of power, the prism of power, the pyramid of power, the pyramids of power, the pyramid of power, the cylinder of power, the cylinders of power, the cylinder of power, the cone of power, the cones of power, the cone of power, the triangle of power, the triangles of power, the triangle of power, the circle of power, the circles of power, the circle of power, the semicircle of power, the semicircles of power, the semicircle of power, the square of power, the squares of power, the square of power, the rectangle of power, the rectangles of power, the rectangle of power, the parallelogram of power, the parallelograms of power, the parallelogram of power, the rhombus of power, the rhombuses of power, the rhombus of power, the trapezoid of power, the trapezoids of power, the trapezoid of power, the polygon of power, the polygons of power, the polygon of power, the pentagon of power, the pentagons of power, the pentagon of power, the hexagon of power, the hexagons of power, the hexagon of power, the septagon of power, the septagons of power, the septagon of power, the octagon of power, the octagons of power, the octagon of power, the nonagon of power, the nonagons of power, the nonagon of power, the decagon of power, the decagons of power, the decagon of power, the evolution of power, the evolutions of power, the evolution of power, the revolution of power, the revolutions of power, the revolution of power, the elemental art of power, the elemental arts of power, the elemental art of power, the elemental science of power, the elemental sciences of power, the elemental science of power, the elemental principle of power, the elemental principles of power, the elemental principle of power, the elemental technology of power, the elemental technologies of power, the elemental technology of power, the low elemental art of power, the low elemental arts of power, the low elemental art of power, the low elemental science of power, the low elemental sciences of power, the low elemental science of power, the low elemental principle of power, the low elemental principles of power, the low elemental principle of power, the low elemental technology of power, the low elemental technologies of power, the low elemental technology of power, the high elemental art of power, the high elemental arts of power, the high elemental art of power, the high elemental science of power, the high elemental sciences of power, the high elemental science of power, the high elemental principle of power, the high elemental principles of power, the high elemental principle of power, the high elemental technology of power, the high elemental technologies of power, the high elemental technology of power, the agent of power, the agents of power, the agent of power, the agency of power, the agencies of power, the agency of power, the amplifier of power, the amplifiers of power, the amplifier of power, the amplification of power, the amplifications of power, the amplification of power, the enhancer of power, the enhancers of power, the enhancer of power, the enhancement of power, the enhancements of power, the enhancement of power, the magnifier of power, the magnifiers of power, the magnifier of power, the magnification of power, the magnifications of power, the magnification of power, the influencer of power, the influencers of power, the influencer of power, the influence of power, the influences of power, the influence of power, the emanator of power, the emanators of power, the emanator of power, the emanation of power, the emanations of power, the emanation of power, the converger of power, the convergers of power, the converger of power, the convergence of power, the convergences of power, the convergence of power, the aura of power, the auras of power, the aura of power, the impression of power, the impressions of power, the impression of power, the intelligence of power, the intelligences of power, the intelligence of power, the sophistication of power, the sophistications of power, the sophistication of power, the genius of power, the geniuses of power, the genius of power, the polymath of power, the polymaths of power, the polymath of power, the psychic of power, the psychics of power, the psychic of power, the knowledge of power, the knowledges of power, the knowledge of power, the understanding of power, the understandings of power, the understanding of power, the wisdom of power, the wisdoms of power, the wisdom of power, the secret of power, the secrets of power, the secret of power, the mystery of power, the mysteries of power, the mystery of power, the revelation of power, the revelations of power, the revelation of power, the tactic of power, the tactics of power, the tactic of power, the strategy of power, the strategies of power, the strategy of power, the strength of power, the strengths of power, the strength of power, the might of power, the mights of power, the might of power, the power of power, the powers of power, the power of power, the authority of power, the authorities of power, the authority of power, the dominion of power, the dominions of power, the dominion of power, the rhythm of power, the rhythms of power, the rhythm of power, the melody of power, the melodies of power, the melody of power, the music of power, the musics of power, the music of power, the lyric of power, the lyrics of power, the lyric of power, the song of power, the songs of power, the song of power, the dance of power, the dances of power, the dance of power, the spirit of power, the spirits of power, the spirit of power, the soul of power, the souls of power, the soul of power, the body of power, the bodies of power, the body of power, the mark of power, the marks of power, the mark of power, the promise of power, the promises of power, the promise of power, the visionary of power, the visionaries of power, the visionary of power, the vision of power, the visions of power, the vision of power, the picture of power, the pictures of power, the picture of power, the sound of power, the sounds of power, the sound of power, the dung of power, the dungs of power, the dung of power, the language of power, the languages of power, the language of power, the communication of power, the communications of power, the communication of power, the people of power, the peoples of power, the people of power, the society of power, the societies of power, the society of power, the fortress of power, the fortresses of power, the fortress of power, the government of power, the governments of power, the government of power, the city of power, the cities of power, the city of power, the nation of power, the nations of power, the nation of power, the civilization of power, the civilizations of power, the civilization of power, the world of power, the worlds of power, the world of power,